At 23 minutes past 1 in the morning on the 26th of April, 1986, a nuclear reactor in the north of Soviet Ukraine was supposed to be undergoing a routine safety test. 40 seconds later, that reactor no longer had a roof, a core, or a future. This is what happened. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant produced electricity for the Soviet grid. It was a large graphite-moderated reactor of a Soviet design known by the initials RBMK. It was considered by the people who ran it and the people who lived beside it to be a safe and proven machine. By the time the sun rose on April 26th, its core was open to the sky, it was on fire, and it was throwing radioactive material into the air of Europe. This is Post-Mortem. We don't sensationalize, we reconstruct. Tonight, the worst accident in the history of nuclear power, and the chain of decisions, design choices, and silences that turned a delayed electrical test into the destruction of a reactor core. We are going to walk it the way an investigator walks it. The reactor, the flaw nobody told the operators about, the test, the night shift that inherited it, the 40 seconds, the fire, and the town that did not know it should already be gone. To understand the night, you first have to understand the machine. A nuclear reactor produces heat by sustaining a controlled chain reaction. Atoms of uranium fuel split, releasing energy and releasing neutrons, and those neutrons go on to split more atoms. The entire art of running a reactor is the art of keeping that chain reaction balanced, hot enough to be useful, never hot enough to run away. The RBMK reactor at Chernobyl did this with two main ingredients besides the fuel. It used graphite as a moderator, large blocks of carbon that slow the neutrons down and help the chain reaction continue. And it used ordinary water, pumped through the core, both to carry the heat away to the turbines and to absorb some of the neutrons. Now here is the first thing you need to hold on to, and it is a strange one. In most reactor designs, water is a friend of safety. If the reactor gets too hot and the water boils away into steam, the chain reaction slows down because the water was helping to sustain it. The machine, left alone, calms itself. The RBMK did not work that way. In the RBMK, the water absorbed neutrons, but the graphite did the moderating. So when the water in the core boiled into steam, you lost the neutron-absorbing effect of the water, but you kept the moderating effect of the graphite. The result was a reactor in which, under certain conditions, boiling the water made the chain reaction faster, not slower. More steam, more power, more power, more steam. Engineers call that a positive feedback. A positive feedback is a reactor with a slope built into it. And just as in the Bhopal episode, the slope runs in only one direction. There was a second part to the flaw, and it lived in the control rods. Control rods are the brakes of a reactor. They are long rods made of a neutron-absorbing material, and when you lower them into the core, they soak up neutrons, slow the chain reaction, and reduce the power. Raising them does the opposite. The control rods in the RBMK had a design feature in their construction. The lower section of each rod, the part that entered the core first, was not made of absorbing material. It was tipped with graphite. And graphite, as you now know, is a moderator. It helps the chain reaction. So in the first moments of lowering a fully withdrawn control rod, the graphite tip went in ahead of the absorber. And for those first few seconds, in the bottom of the core, the rod did not break the reaction. It accelerated it. The single action an operator would take to shut the reactor down had hidden inside it a brief and violent kick of the wrong direction. I want to be exact about who knew about these flaws, because that question is the moral center of this disaster. The positive feedback under low water, high steam conditions, and the control rod tip effect, these were not unknown to the people who designed the RBMK and the people at the top of the Soviet nuclear establishment. There had been earlier incidents at other reactors that had pointed directly at the rod design. The information existed, but it existed inside a system that treated such information as sensitive, as inconvenient, as a thing to be managed rather than shared. The operators at Chernobyl, the engineers who would be in the control room of reactor number 4 on the night of April 25th, had not been clearly and fully told. They had not been trained to understand that the machine they ran had a region of operation in which it would turn against them, and that the shutdown button itself carried a sting. You cannot ask a crew to respect a danger you have decided, for reasons of secrecy, not to tell them exists. The accident happened during a test. And the test in itself was a reasonable idea. It was an attempt to close a genuine safety gap. Here was the concern the test was meant to address. If the plant ever lost its outside electrical power, the reactor would shut down, but it would still need power to run its cooling pumps. Because a reactor that has just shut down is still extremely hot and still must be cooled. Emergency diesel generators existed to provide that power, but the diesels took a short time to start up and reach full output. The question was, what would carry the cooling pumps through that gap, the few tens of seconds between losing grid power and the diesels coming online? The proposed answer was elegant. The reactor's own turbine, even as it spun down, even as it coasted to a halt, would still generate some electricity from its rotating inertia. The test was meant to prove that this coasting turbine could power the essential pumps long enough to bridge the gap. The test had been attempted before, at Chernobyl and elsewhere, and had not fully succeeded. This was, in effect, another run at a problem the plant had been trying to solve. The test was primarily an electrical test, a test of generators and pumps and voltages. And that framing matters because it shaped how the test was treated. It was thought of by many of the people involved as an electrical engineering exercise rather than as a nuclear one. The crucial misjudgment was this. Conducting the test required the reactor to be brought to a particular low power level and held there, with particular systems configured in particular ways. The test was planned and approved as an electrical procedure, but the reactor states it required were nuclear states, and the people who wrote and approved the procedure did not adequately analyze what those states would mean for the stability of the core. A test designed to make the plant safer was approved without a proper safety analysis of the test itself. The test was scheduled for the daytime of April 25th, 1986. And in the daytime, with the day shift, with the engineers who had prepared for it, the test would have been run by the people who had the most context for it. The plan was to gradually reduce the reactor's power through the day, run the test in the afternoon, and then shut the reactor down for a scheduled maintenance period. The power reduction began on schedule that morning, and then, in the early afternoon, a request came in from the regional electricity grid controller. The grid needed Chernobyl's output. There was demand on the system that afternoon, and a reactor that was halfway down toward its test condition was, from the grid's point of view, an inconvenient loss of supply. The grid controller asked Chernobyl to delay, to hold the reactor where it was, at a reduced but still substantial power level, and continue feeding electricity to the grid until the evening. The plant agreed to the delay. And that single, ordinary administrative decision is the hinge of the entire disaster. Because the delay did something the test plan had never accounted for. It meant the reactor would now be held for hours at a partial power level, in a configuration partway through its preparation. And critically, it meant that when the test was finally run, it would be run not by the experienced day shift that had prepared for it, but by a later shift, in the dark, working from a procedure that the day had not finished executing. The test was carried by the grid's convenience straight out of the daylight and into the night. No one decided to run the most delicate part of a reactor test with a handover crew at 1:30 in the morning. It simply happened because a series of reasonable people each made a reasonable local decision, and the accumulation of those decisions put the test where no one would ever have chosen to put it. The delay lasted into the late evening of April 25th. When the grid finally released Chernobyl from supplying power, the plant resumed bringing the reactor down toward the test condition. By now, it was night. The shift in the control room of reactor number 4 was the night shift, and they were preparing to carry out the final part of a test that the day had set up and not completed. To run the test, the operators needed to reduce the reactor's power to a specified low level, a level low enough for the electrical conditions the test required. And here, the night ran into the first serious trouble. As the power was being reduced toward that target level, the reactor's power fell much further and faster than intended. It dropped to a very low level, far below the level the test called for, almost to nothing. Why the power dropped so far is a detail the investigations examined closely. The reduction of a reactor's power is a delicate process, and at low power, a graphite reactor builds up a population of substances inside its fuel that absorb neutrons and make the reactor harder to keep running, an effect that intensifies as the power falls and as time passes at low power. The reactor, in effect, becomes sluggish, poisoned, reluctant. The crew now faced a decision. The power had collapsed to a near shutdown level. The disciplined choice, the choice that the design margins and good practice supported, would have been to recognize that the reactor was now in a poisoned, unstable, low condition, to accept that the test could not be safely run that night, and to proceed with the planned shutdown. Instead, the decision was made to recover the power, to raise the control rods, override the reluctance of the poisoned core, and bring the reactor back up to a level where the test could be attempted. The crew were under pressure. The test had already been delayed once. There was an expectation that it would be completed, and so they pulled the reactor back from the edge of shutdown. And in doing so, they walked it into the most dangerous condition it could occupy. I want to describe that condition precisely, because everything now depends on it. To raise the power of a poisoned reactor, the operators had to withdraw a large number of control rods, far more than would normally be out of the core. By the time the power had been coaxed back up and roughly stabilized, the reactor was running with very few control rods left inserted. The number of rods left in the core is what nuclear engineers call the operating reactivity margin. It is, in plain terms, the reactor's reserve of braking power. How much shutdown capacity is available at any moment? The RBMK had a minimum margin below which it was not supposed to be operated, precisely because, below that margin, the reactor became dangerously hard to control and dangerously slow to shut down. By the time the crew had recovered the power, the reactor was operating with its braking reserve drawn down far below that minimum. And on top of that, to hold the recovered power stable, the crew had configured the cooling system in a way that meant the core was now full of water close to boiling, with very little of the steam that would normally be present. The reactor was now poised exactly in the region where boiling the water would sharply increase the power, the positive feedback region the operators had never been clearly told about. So I am going to pause the clock here before the test even begins and lay the situation out flat, because the investigators did exactly this, and the picture is the explanation. The reactor was running at a power level it had been dragged back up to. Its braking reserve was drawn down far below the legal minimum. Its cooling system was configured with the core full of near boiling water and very little steam. It was sitting squarely in a regime where any increase in steam would increase the power. And the crew operating it had not been told that this regime existed or that their shutdown rods carried a graphite-tipped kick at the start of their travel. Every one of those facts is a hole in exactly the sense the Bhopal episode described. Holes in the design, holes in the training, holes in the procedure, holes in the discipline of that particular night. The test had not started, and the holes had already lined up. What happened next did not need to be large. It only needed to be a beginning. At 23 minutes and 4 seconds past 1 in the morning on April 26, 1986, the test began. On the operator's command, the steam supply to the turbine was cut. The turbine began to coast down, its rotation slowing, and as planned, the electricity it generated while coasting began to power the cooling pumps the test was designed to evaluate. And here the positive feedback closed its hand. As the coasting turbine slowed, the pumps it powered slowed with it. The flow of cooling water through the core began to reduce. Less flow meant the water moving through the core had more time to heat up, and so more of it began to boil into steam. More steam in this reactor, in this configuration, meant more power, and more power meant more heat, which boiled more water, which made more steam, which raised the power again. The slope had been touched. The reactor began, slowly at first, to climb. In the control room, the operator saw the power beginning to rise, and rise faster than it should. At 23 minutes and 40 seconds past 1, the shift supervisor gave the order to shut the reactor down. The button was pressed that drives all the control rods, the full reserve of braking power, down into the core at once. The emergency shutdown, the single action that should, in any reactor, end any problem. And the rods began to fall. And the graphite tips went in first. Into the bottom of a core that was already climbing, already full of steam, already in its positive feedback regime, came a sudden insertion of graphite, a moderator, displacing water across the lower region of the core. For a few seconds, in the place where it could do the most harm, the shutdown system did the opposite of shutting down. It added a violent push to a reactor that was already running away. The power of the reactor in the next few seconds rose to many times its normal full output. No structure, no fuel, no cooling channel built for a steady industrial power level could survive a surge of that magnitude. The fuel inside the channels overheated catastrophically and shattered. Fragments of intensely hot fuel met the cooling water, and the result was a violent steam explosion, a sudden, enormous generation of steam pressure inside the core. That first explosion lifted the upper biological shield of the reactor, an immense circular slab, a piece of the reactor's own structure, weighing in the region of 1,000 tons. It lifted it and displaced it. The core was breached. The fuel channels were severed. A second explosion followed within seconds. Its exact mechanism has been studied and debated. It involved the further violent release of energy from the destroyed core, but its effect is not in doubt. It tore the reactor open. It blew the roof off the reactor building, and it threw fragments of the core, intensely radioactive fuel and burning graphite, up into the night air and out across the surrounding site. Within minutes of the explosions, the fire brigade based at the plant was responding. Other fire crews from Pripyat, the town built to house the plant's workers, and from the wider district were called in behind them. These men arrived at a reactor building with its roof gone, fires burning across the structure, and burning fragments of graphite scattered around the site. And here is the central terrible fact about the first response to Chernobyl. The firefighters were not told what they were standing in. They were experienced men, and they fought the fire with skill and with extraordinary courage. They worked to stop the fires from spreading, in particular, to stop them from reaching the adjacent reactor number 3, which was still operating. But they had not been informed because the people directing the early response did not themselves yet grasp or accept the scale of what had happened, that the air around them, the debris under their boots, the smoke they were breathing, carried lethal levels of radiation. They were fighting what they believed was a serious industrial fire. They were, in fact, standing inside an open reactor core. The radiation doses received by the first crews on and around the reactor building that night were, in many cases, enormous. The effects of a very high radiation dose do not always announce themselves immediately. A person can feel, in the first hours, only nausea, weakness, a strange taste, a reddening of the skin, and then seem to recover, before the deeper damage to the body declares itself in the days that follow. This pattern is part of why the danger was so insidious that night. In the hours after the explosion, many of the firefighters and plant workers who had received severe doses were taken first to the medical facilities in Pripyat, and then onward, the most serious cases flown to a specialist hospital. A number of the firefighters and plant staff who responded in those first hours died in the weeks that followed of acute radiation effects. They are among the most directly identifiable victims of the disaster. In the Piper Alpha episode and the Bhopal episode, I described the thin line of people who turn toward the danger because their job tells them to. At Chernobyl, that line turned toward a danger they could not see, could not smell, and had not been warned about. The record of the channel does not contain a clearer example of that courage or of that betrayal of it. While the firefighters worked, a separate effort was underway inside the surviving parts of the plant. Operators and engineers worked through the night in the damaged buildings, shutting down systems, attempting to pump water, trying to bring reactor number 3 to a safe state, working in conditions of high radiation and great confusion. The plant's own management spent the early hours struggling to establish what had actually happened. Some of the instruments that would have revealed the true radiation levels were limited in their range or unavailable or distrusted. Reports that the core itself was destroyed met resistance because the destruction of the core was, to the people receiving the reports, very nearly unthinkable. There is a recurring feature of large disasters that Chernobyl shows in its purest form. In the first hours, the people in charge often do not believe the worst report they are being given. Not because they are foolish, but because the worst report describes a world they have been assured for years cannot exist. An RBMK reactor could not explode. The operators had been told that. Their managers had been told that. So when one did, the truth had to fight its way upward against everything the system believed about itself. 3 kilometers from reactor number 4 was the town of Pripyat. Pripyat was a new town built in the 1970s specifically to house the workers of the Chernobyl plant and their families. It was, by Soviet standards, a good place to live. Modern apartment blocks, schools, a hospital, a culture palace, a riverside, an amusement park being prepared for an opening in the coming days. The population was around 49,000 people, and it was a young town, full of children. On the night of the explosion, and through the morning of April 26th, the people of Pripyat were not told what had happened. They could see, some of them, that something had occurred at the plant, a glow, smoke, the movement of fire engines, but the town was not warned, was not advised to stay indoors, was not advised to close its windows, was not advised to keep its children inside. The morning of April 26th in Pripyat was a Saturday in spring, and so people did what people do on a fine Saturday. They went outside. Children played in the open air. Some accounts describe people gathering where they could see the plant, watching the unusual glow, entirely unaware that the air they were standing in was the most dangerous thing in their lives. The decision to evacuate Pripyat was not made on the morning of the 26th. It was made the following afternoon. The evacuation of the town began on April 27th, more than a day and a half after the explosion. When it came, the evacuation itself was, in operational terms, carried out rapidly and in good order. A very large fleet of buses was assembled and brought to the town. The residents were told the evacuation was temporary, that they should bring documents and essentials for a few days, that they would be able to return. They were not able to return. Pripyat was never reoccupied. The temporary evacuation was permanent, and the town has stood empty from that week to this day. But the operational speed of the evacuation, once it was finally ordered, cannot be separated from the day and a half that came before it. For a day and a half, a town of 49,000 people, many of them children, lived and breathed and played outdoors inside a contaminated zone, without being told to take even the simplest protective measure. The single most consequential failure of the response to Chernobyl was not technical. It was the failure to tell people early what was happening to the air around them. In the days and weeks that followed, the protective zone was widened far beyond Pripyat. An exclusion zone was established around the plant, eventually a region of roughly 30 kilometers radius, and an irregular area beyond it where contamination had fallen. In total, the evacuations and resettlements that followed Chernobyl removed well over 100,000 people from their homes, and that number grew further in the resettlements of later years. Villages, farms, whole communities were emptied, and in many cases, never returned to. The radioactive material thrown up by the destroyed core did not respect the exclusion zone or the Soviet border. Carried by the winds of late April and early May 1986, it was detected first abroad, not by any Soviet announcement, but by a nuclear power station in Sweden, whose own staff found radioactivity on themselves and traced it, correctly, to a source far to the east. It was, in the end, the radiation arriving in Scandinavia that forced the disaster into the open. The contamination spread in varying and uneven concentrations across a wide area of Europe. A reactor accident in the north of Soviet Ukraine had become, within days, a problem on the soil of a continent. While the population was being moved, an immense effort was underway at the plant itself to bring the destroyed reactor under control. The exposed core was still intensely hot and still releasing radioactive material into the air. The first and most urgent task was to stop that release. Over a period of days, helicopter crews flew over the open reactor and dropped thousands of tons of material into and around it. Sand, clay, lead, boron-bearing compounds chosen to smother the burning graphite, to absorb neutrons, and to filter and reduce the radioactive plume. The crews flew these missions over an open reactor core, receiving radiation doses with every pass. Beneath the reactor, a separate fear took hold. The concern was that the molten material from the core could melt downward through the structure and reach water that had collected below, or reach the foundations and the soil. To address that fear, miners were brought to Chernobyl from the coal regions and set to work tunneling beneath the reactor, in heat and in danger, to install a protective structure under the core. The work of containing Chernobyl was carried out overwhelmingly by ordinary people doing physical labor in extraordinary conditions. Hundreds of thousands of people, soldiers, engineers, miners, scientists, drivers, laborers, were ultimately involved in the response and the cleanup over the months and years that followed. They became known by a single word: the liquidators. Their work was to liquidate the consequences of the accident. The liquidators cleared the most contaminated debris by hand from the roof areas around the reactor in shifts measured in seconds and minutes because the radiation was too intense for anything longer. They decontaminated buildings and land. They felled and buried a forest near the plant that had taken a lethal dose and died. They built the structure that would, by the end of 1986, enclose the destroyed reactor. That structure, a vast, hurriedly engineered shell of steel and concrete built around reactor number 4, became known as the sarcophagus. It was a remarkable feat of construction under impossible conditions. It was also always understood to be a temporary measure, and decades later, it would itself be enclosed within a second, larger, purpose-built containment structure. The work of those people held the disaster. Whatever the failures that caused Chernobyl, the response, once it was finally underway in earnest, was an act of collective labor and collective sacrifice on a scale that is difficult to fully take in. The human cost of Chernobyl is, like the human cost of Bhopal, a subject of serious and long-running dispute, and I am going to give it to you the honest way. The number of people who died in the immediate aftermath, in the explosion, and from acute radiation effects in the weeks that followed is relatively small and relatively well established. It is counted in the dozens. The plant staff and firefighters who received the highest doses on the first night and in the days after. But the immediate death toll is not the measure of a radiation disaster. The harder question is the long-term one. The additional cancers and the additional deaths spread thinly across a large population and a long span of years that the released radiation will have caused or will yet cause. Estimates of that long-term toll vary very widely, depending on the assumptions and the methods used, and reasonable expert bodies have produced figures that differ from one another substantially. I am not going to pretend to a precision the science does not support. The honest, defensible statement is this: Chernobyl killed dozens of people quickly and with certainty. It has caused a significant burden of illness across the affected populations, and the full long-term toll is genuinely uncertain and genuinely contested. It also inflicted a vast non-fatal harm: the loss of homes, of land, of livelihoods, of a sense of safety on hundreds of thousands of people. That harm is real, even where it cannot be counted in deaths. Chernobyl was investigated intensively by Soviet bodies and by international ones, and the understanding of its causes changed significantly over time. And that change is itself an important part of the story. The first official Soviet account placed the weight of the blame on the operators. It described a catalog of operator errors and procedural violations on the night of the test: the running of the reactor below its breaking margin, the configuration of the cooling system, the disabling or overriding of certain protections in order to keep the test going. And those operator actions were real. They happened. They were genuine contributing causes. But that first account was incomplete, and in a crucial respect, it was misleading. It told the story as though a fundamentally sound reactor had been wrecked by a reckless crew. It did not give due weight to the design flaws of the RBMK, the positive feedback in the relevant regime, and the graphite-tipped control rods, or to the fact that those flaws had been known at high levels and concealed from the operators. Later analysis, international review, and a more honest Soviet reckoning as the years passed corrected the balance. The mature understanding of Chernobyl, the one the weight of expert review now supports, is not that the operators were innocent, and not that the reactor alone was to blame. It is that the disaster was the product of both, locked together. The reactor had dangerous characteristics that its operators were not told about. The operators, working under pressure, took the reactor into exactly the region where those characteristics became lethal. Neither half, on its own, would have produced the explosion. The operator's actions were only catastrophic because the reactor was flawed. The reactor's flaws only mattered because the operators were never warned to keep away from them. And standing behind both halves was a third cause, larger than either: a system, an entire institutional culture in which safety-relevant information was secret, in which inconvenient findings did not travel, in which the admission of a flaw was a danger to a career, and so the flaw was simply not admitted. The RBMK reactors that continued to operate after the disaster were modified, their control rods redesigned, their margins changed, their operating rules tightened, to remove the specific instability that destroyed reactor number 4. The flaw, once it could no longer be denied, was fixable. It had always been fixable. It had simply never been allowed to be a flaw. This is the pattern Post-Mortem returns to, and Chernobyl states it with a terrible clarity. A catastrophic accident is almost never one mistake, and almost never one villain. At Chernobyl, the holes were these: a reactor with a concealed instability, a control rod with a concealed kick, a test approved without a proper nuclear safety analysis, a grid request that pushed the test from day into night, a crew that recovered a poisoned reactor instead of shutting it down, a breaking margin drawn below its legal minimum, a cooling configuration that placed the core in its most dangerous regime. And beneath all of it, a culture of secrecy that had kept the operators ignorant of the very dangers they needed most to respect. On almost any other night, those holes would not all have lined up. The test had failed before without disaster. The reactor had been run before without exploding. But on the night of April 26, 1986, every hole lined up at once, and the path ran open and clear, all the way from a flawed design and a delayed test to the destruction of a reactor core and the contamination of a continent. Chernobyl did not leave the world's nuclear industry unchanged. No disaster of this magnitude ever does. The most important changes were not only about steel and control rods, they were about information and about culture. After Chernobyl, the international nuclear community built and strengthened mechanisms for sharing safety experience across borders. The principle that an incident or a near miss at one plant in one country is a lesson that every operator of every plant has a right and a need to learn. The idea that safety-relevant information could be a national secret, a thing withheld for prestige, was discredited by the contamination of a continent. A nuclear accident, the world understood after April 1986, does not stay inside the country that has it. And so, the safety of nuclear power could no longer be treated as a purely national affair. The disaster also hardened a principle within reactor engineering itself. The RBMK had a region of operation in which the machine's own physics worked against the operator, in which the reactor, disturbed, tended to climb rather than to settle. The lesson the industry took and reinforced was that a reactor should be designed wherever possible so that its fundamental physics pull it toward safety, not away from it. So that if something goes wrong and the machine is left alone, the laws of physics themselves bring it down rather than driving it up. A reactor whose safety depends on the operator always being right is a reactor that is one bad night away from disaster. In the Bhopal episode, the principle was called inherent safety. The safest tank is a nearly empty one. In reactor terms, it wears a different name, but it is the same idea. The strongest safety system is the one built into the nature of the thing itself so that it does not depend on a tired human being making the correct decision at 1:30 in the morning. And Chernobyl reshaped permanently what the public would tolerate in the way of official silence. The day and a half before Pripyat was evacuated, the days before the wider world was told, the reliance on a foreign country's instruments to break the news, all of it taught a hard lesson about the cost of a state managing the truth of a disaster rather than telling it. In the years that followed, the expectation took hold, unevenly but genuinely, that the public has a right to prompt, honest information when something has gone wrong with a hazardous installation near them, and that the instinct to delay the bad news, to control it, to protect the institution, is itself one of the things that kills people. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl still exists. It is a strange and quiet place, a landscape from which people were removed and to which the forest and the animals have, in their own way, returned. It stands as the largest and most literal memorial any industrial disaster has ever produced. A region of a country set aside indefinitely because of 40 seconds on one night in April. The town of Pripyat is still there. Empty. The apartment blocks still stand among the trees that have grown wild around them. The school, the culture palace, the amusement park with its wheel that, by most accounts, never opened for the public it was built for. The town has become one of the most photographed empty places on Earth, a fixed image of a Saturday in spring that was simply stopped. The people of Pripyat scattered across the Soviet Union and beyond. The liquidators carried their service, and in many cases their illness, into the decades that followed. The firefighters who died in the first weeks are buried and remembered and named. That is the truth that Post-Mortem keeps returning to, and it is the truth I want to leave you with tonight. A nuclear reactor is not only physics and engineering and a contribution to a national grid, it is a promise made to every person who lives within reach of it, and because the wind does not stop at a border, to a great many people who live well beyond that reach. At Chernobyl, that promise was hollowed out in advance, not by one act of malice, by a design flaw that was known and concealed, by a test that was approved without being understood, by a crew that was never told what to fear, by a culture that treated the truth as a thing to be managed, until one night in April, the promise was simply not there, and a reactor that the world had been assured could not explode did. None of the change that came afterward, the sharing of safety experience, the discipline of inherent safety, the public's right to the truth, none of it happened because the system, left alone, decided to do better. It happened because a reactor core was thrown into the sky, because firefighters died not knowing what had burned them, because a town of 49,000 people lost its home forever, and the world could not look away from the size of it. Thank you for sitting with this one. If reconstructions like this matter to you, subscribe. The channel is here for them.